Hello there. My name's Andrew Cowley, and I'm delighted to have been asked by Teachit to speak to you in their latest of their SLT series, Teachit Talks. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about a culture of wellbeing, particularly in relation to providing a wellbeing curriculum for your younger children. So, as you can see, I've called this talk The Culture of Wellbeing, Wellbeing as Curriculum. Well, what does wellbeing for children look like? Do we need to go beyond that very simple wellbeing is simply the absence of illness and being well? I think we need to go a little further, because well-being is for every day, as you all know if you've heard me speaking about well-being for staff. For children, I don't think we should be compartmentalizing our well-being lessons into happiness lessons, whatever a happiness lesson looks like. Well-being is indeed an everyday experience. So for our children, I believe we need to be providing an experience in school that is empathetic and honest and enables them to be taught the skills of empathy and honesty. Well-being needs to be collective because it is a universal offer. It's for every single person. Some children are obviously going to need a little more in the way of well-being and emotional support than others, but let's not forget those children who outwardly show their confidence or who remain quiet or more reticent. Everyone is entitled to a dose of well-being. In this way, well-being should also be routine, part of the daily routine the children come through, from the minute they walk in through the gate to the minute they go home, and indeed beyond, because so much these days our children and our parents are in touch with us beyond the traditional times that they are in school. Well-being needs to be part of good relationships in school culture. If you've got sound well-being for your staff, this will echo through into well-being for your children. And indeed, we need to think about the triangulation between staff, parents, and children in everything we do, but particularly in relation to that rather abstract notion of well-being. Because ultimately, if well-being is for every day and it is for everyone, well-being, I hope you will see, is a life skill, and a lifelong one at that. But I'd like to think about well-being in terms of character. Now, there's been a lot about character education from the DfE in recent years, and this is updated as recently as 2019. But it was first mentioned by Nikki Morgan, who has written extensively about character education as well. And this is also supported by the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham. But if you look at the DfE character education guidelines, there are 6 character benchmarks. So what kind of school are we? Does your school clearly convey a sense of pride and belonging? Are the children and parents and staff pleased to be part of the learning community? There's an awful lot that we can link well-being to. We can think about reward and recognition, embedding a sense of pride. Do you give rewards that are merely tokenistic, or are they meaningful? If we really are the kind of school we want to promote effective well-being, it will reflect the culture and relationships in the school and the sense of pride and belonging into that community. Secondly, what are our expectations of behaviour towards each other? And by behaviour, we need to look beyond behaviour policy, rewards and sanctions and how they're applied. Because behaviour policies are only as good as the teacher that applies them. Children need to understand that rules are there and they need to feel safe and secure. Do we articulate that to them? Do your conversations about behaviour focus on reward, or do they focus on sanction and punishment? A behaviour system that's focused on keeping children in line may in their wording promote good manners, respect for others, or consideration or empathy. But have a think about your rules. Do they begin with do or do not? That's an important measure of difference. Behaviour expectations in school promoting good character will proactively promote the essential character traits we wish to see in our young people. Then we have resilience and confidence. Resilience, or more specifically mental resilience, is sometimes referred to as grit. And this can be built in any number of ways. You may have a display such as "be the best that you can be" or similar. And this may be very familiar, particularly in the primary sector. Is that message built effectively into your curriculum experience? If it's not, it remains rather hollow. It needs to really engage with the growth mindset mentality in your school. Anyone familiar with the work of Carol Dweck will know a little bit more about what growth mindset means. And then you have the quality of the co-curriculum. In terms of the wider curriculum, that part of school life that isn't covered by the national curriculum, religious education or assemblies, what do we provide in our schools, particularly if we have high numbers of disadvantaged children in receipt of the pupil premium? What do we invest that in? Sports, particularly, are used to help build character. But do we focus on character or sporting prowess? Is it all about winning? Or is it knowing how to lose with grace, having a sense of fair play, respect for the decisions of officials? Rugby and martial arts are essential sports to try and include because they have very strong moral codes. Anyone familiar with the game of rugby knows that any disagreement with the referee is punished with a 10-yard movements of territory. In the martial arts, there is absolute respect for the authority of officials. Then we have volunteering and service to others. What sort of things do children do to help others beyond the community? Volunteering is a great way to engage your parents as well. Do you take the choir to the local care home? Do you have established relationships between the school and local businesses? What sort of links do you have with local charities, particularly linked to the food bank at a harvest festival? Do you promote the notion of being good junior citizens, particularly something that will be familiar to many Year 6 children? And finally, does every child benefit from the offer? Now dig down below the surface. No two schools are the same. Communities and catchments contrast, even within two schools within walking distance of each other. But there'll be differences within the community. New housing, transport links, job opportunities, and local economic fortunes can all affect the composition of the school. Do we share the access to good character development between every member of our school community? Do we aspire to the absolute very best for our children? I'd like you to bear character education in mind as we progress through the rest of our journey through our wellbeing curriculum, because wellbeing and character sit together. And I hope from this you will see that wellbeing is much more than simply being well, but building into it a notion of care and dedication to a community. The The wellbeing curriculum comes into three parts: knowing yourself, knowing others, and putting values into action. The first part of knowing yourself is self-awareness. And within self-awareness, we can think about being aware of our own and others' mental health, ways of seeking strategies for support. Now, we're not going to be mental health experts. Every school, though, will need to have a designated mental health lead, and many schools at the current time are developing that particular prowess. 1 in 6 children will have a diagnosed or diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their school life. That does mean that many others won't, but that doesn't mean they're not going to have issues with their mental health, and they need to be taught about being aware of identifying their own stresses and things that upset them, and also things that they can do to help themselves feeling better about themselves. So within this, we do need to think about teaching emotional intelligence, teaching children about the impact of what they do, their words, their deeds, and indeed their thoughts upon other people, knowing when they might hurt or upset somebody by what they do, and recognizing what the consequences of that might be. Alongside this, we also need to think about teaching behavior. Now, whether you are in a more traditional school, which might have some lessons which does involve marching children up the left-hand side of the corridor in silence and into the hall without a word, or whether you do that by modelling, either of those models actually gives a way of actually teaching behaviour, modelling it directly or indirectly. And also manners and social graces are incredibly important. Those 2 little words of please and thank you, knowing when to say yes and no, and knowing how to say those politely, are things that not all our children come to school equipped with, but ones which, if we are absolutely insistent upon in an empathetic manner, can go an awful long way to establishing those children's reputations and good manners within the school and community. Start early, and that will serve those children well. Not something to impose, to be scared of, but because it's a good human value. Then we can also have a think in our wellbeing curriculum about teaching healthy lifestyle choices. Now, many of these will be in the national curriculum, as you will know, but I'd like you to think about getting away from the notion of token days and token weeks, and also simply about teaching it at the point in the national curriculum in your year group when it's due. Healthy food choices is a choice beyond the curriculum, and is something schools can actually be promoting outside of lessons. The obvious time is playtimes and your healthy snacks the children might bring in if you run those in your school, but also at lunchtimes. Do your school council, for example, liaise with your catering firm about the kinds of things that children would like to have on their menu? Do the school council think about how healthy those meals are? Perhaps you can also have children who look at the contents of packed lunches. It's very difficult in a busy lunchtime for our midday staff to have a look at every single lunch that comes in. But effectively monitoring those with children as monitors is an excellent way of modelling good, healthy lunches and checking up on things like, do children only have water, or do they bring in juices? Do they bring in fruit? Or is there a surfeit of chocolate and sweet snacks as well? Having to think about your policy and promoting that beyond the national curriculum is a really effective way of promoting well-being, because if you're only doing it in lesson times, you're not getting a longevity there. And this is a lifelong decision. So that needs to be emphasized every day. Do you think about physical activity outside of PE? Are the 2 or 3 PE lessons that children get the only times they do physical things? Because physical activity is obviously very good for our physical health. It's also very good for our mental health because you are triggering endorphins, one of those feel-good hormones. You may well do the daily mile. And we know that when children do that, some will run because they're very enthusiastic. Some may walk at a more leisurely pace. But even walking at an effective pace, you may do a little encouragement there, is also an excellent form of physical activity. So if they walk the daily mile rather than run it, they are still doing themselves good. But do you have other things that you offer your children other than the stereotypical games of football on the playground? Are there other things they can do? Your midday supervisors are fantastic for supporting here. Skipping games, they're not gender specific. Everyone engages in them. Are there different games that children invent? Give a child a ball and a wall. Guaranteed they can probably invent some game to play individually, pairs, or in a small team. That's how, after all, many of our games that are our current major sports actually began life. They were invented by people who just had a small space and a ball to play with and a number of people. And then there are some specific things which, again, are often covered in token weeks: road safety, stranger danger, bacteria and viruses, and alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. Road safety and stranger danger are very typically covered in assemblies. Stranger danger is a bit of an old-fashioned term now, but it's about being safe around people you don't know. That and road safety, I think we will all agree, are absolutely essential things for teaching children. And here it's about awareness of their own safety, because however much you teach some children, some of them aren't always aware and maybe a little naive. Teaching without scaring is important. Bacteria and viruses has been a very obvious matter of discussion in the last couple of years. But let's not just think of pandemics. Let's think about generally good habits. Catch it and bin it with sneezes and coughs is a very simple thing, which we had in place much before. Good hand washing is an essential habit, not just because of what's happened in the last year or two. And then finally, alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, traditionally given to year 5 and 6 teachers to work on their children with. But again, sometimes schools taught us very scary, when in fact, many of our children will see many of these things in their own home, because they will see the parents, perhaps with a bottle of wine in the fridge. Doesn't mean that they're alcoholics. It means that they are drinking wine in a responsible way. And responsibility is an important thing to teach. Again, also with tobacco. Health risks also need to be acknowledged, but perhaps thinking about why tobacco is smoked, as well as the impact of what it does. Not simply being judgmental about the impacts of it are equally as important as avoiding that risk. And with drugs as well, we're not simply talking about illegal and hard drugs. Children will have medication at home. It's something that goes into the body to have a curative impact in many ways. So a conversation about what they are, as well as knowing how to be treating them safely, is absolutely crucial. And then we have the environment and climate change. The reason I've included this within my thoughts about the wellbeing curriculum is that children are concerned about the environment. There was a survey carried out by Newsround a few years ago, and this was about children's fears about the environment. And very many of our children do have a genuine concern about the environment that they are in and that they're going to grow up in. And again, rather than simply scaring children about the environment, let's have a think about the things that actually impact them. The environment does matter to children. Air pollution is a very obvious one, particularly if you are in a school in a major town and city and your playground abuts the main road. Near to where I live, I can think of several schools where the main road is only separated from the playground by the outside wall of the school. In some of those schools, they have a very high level of asthma and children with other breathing difficulties. Rather than just simply standing and protesting every so often about that, this is an ideal opportunity to teach children about the impact on air pollution of traffic and industry. And an ideal way to address this in a little more depth is to think about how you may protest your point of view about that. Letter writing and other campaigning, rather than a physical protest, which may get you some coverage in the newspapers, but may not get a stronger result. But certainly, writing to MPs and local council can have an impact, particularly in traffic calming measures. Water saving, again, is something that you can really teach with your children. And in the classroom, the obvious one, aside from how much water you use on watering your plants, is on that time-honoured task of washing up the paint palettes. More experienced colleagues will be very familiar with the tap being left run to clean those pallets off. But have a think about actually teaching the children about how to wash those paint palettes with one bowl of water. Saving that amount of water is going to have an impact on the school's water bill, but it's modelling to children how much we should look after our water. It's not an endless supply, however much rain we might feel we have. Appreciating the value of it is absolutely crucial. Recycling and plastics in particular are also something that children are very dedicated to. It's an ideal thing to do to actually collect waste plastics from home and bring in the bottles that children have found, just to show how much is used in the local community. Reusing those, turning them into things like bird feeders, or in one particular case, so in my school, turning it into an equivalent of a Christmas tree. In the last school I worked in, we actually saved up green water bottles and used that as our Christmas tree at the local church. Let's just say it made quite an impact, because all the other schools had a traditional tree with decorations that children had made. Everything our school had made, the tree included, was made entirely from recycled materials, and it certainly made an impact and got people thinking. Biodiversity is something you can also celebrate within your school. And actually having a think about what biodiversity you have on your school site. Even if you don't have access to a field or a garden, there will be spaces that you can develop an element of biodiversity. There will be at least some area of ground that you can dig into or can create. Which is why I really very strongly advocate gardening in the national curriculum, in the broader wellbeing curriculum, in fact. I call it pots and plots. You may be fortunate enough to have a school garden, as I have done in the schools I've worked in, but some more inner city sites may not have that. But you can certainly create that opportunity. Create those pots, reuse some of those plastic bottles that children bring in to create your own pots. It's a very easy conversion to make. A bit of smoothing off of the top, a few holes, a bit of compost, you have an instant pot. You have several of them at different heights. You have an instant display of greenery and flowers, and perhaps even some vegetables that you can produce in a very small space. And why not think about, if you have a school field, giving some of that over to creating some vegetable plots. Or perhaps even, if you have allotments nearby, making an application for an allotment and allocating a space on that to each class. Taking an afternoon out every so often to care for the allotment is an important life skill, and also will help children appreciate things like seasonality and sustaining ourselves with appropriate products. Then I'd like us to think about what it's like for other people. This is part 2, knowing others. And authentic kindness is what I'd like us to think about, because kindness beats bullying every time. Bullying is one of the very obvious things that impacts children's well-being in school. And there are probably at least 1/3 of your children would express the feeling that they have been bullied at some point in their life in school. Kindness beats bullying every time, but kindness needs to be authentic. It's a life habit, being kind, not something simply to do on Random Acts of Kindness Day. Let's make kindness a habit with our children. Anyone who's been familiar with the book Wonder by R.J. Palacio will know that that really does promote the ethic of choose kind. If kindness is authentic, it means getting rid of those inauthentic ones. There are 3 kinds. It's performative, manipulative, and oversweetened. Now, performative kindness is very typically shown by children who may want to go out first at break time. And what they will do is they'll sit up the straightest, put their fingers on their lips, and look like they're ready. It's a performance. But what if that child had not done their very best in the lesson? If they've been a little disruptive, they've been chatty, and they've not got on with things? Other people will soon see through that performance if that person is always first out because they have the appearance of being ready. And then you have manipulative kindness. And this is sometimes done by people who want to be controlling. It's actually a form of bullying in some ways, a show of kindness. Oh, I'm looking after this person, when in reality, they have been perhaps a little unpleasant to them. Happens with adults as well. And then oversweetened kindness, which would be a bit overwhelming as well. And sometimes that can come from performative and manipulative as well. Children are very good at identifying that. And the authentic kindness is what we as teachers need to model, and also need to reward when we see that from other children. Kindness isn't done for reward, but our children might be noticed for doing things well. And again, this will help it become a habit that will feed into good well-being habits. And alongside this, it's important to teach the value of forgiveness and how to give a genuine apology. A genuine apology has 3 parts. There's the actual saying sorry. There's why you're sorry. And then there's what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And this makes it a thinking process. Because if it's just a mumbled sorry, there's no meaning to it, because that just means it will happen again. But actually thinking it through and thinking about impact is incredibly important to children. Then a rather obvious one for wellbeing is e-safety and cyberbullying. And this is something that has very definitely increased during the pandemic, because there's been increased reliance on learning on digital devices for very obvious reasons. But also, children have become a lot more reliant upon devices. You have a device, you create instantly a feeling of device envy and peer pressure in many ways. Have a think about the conversations that you hear, particularly with older children. I'm getting this particular model of iPhone, I'm getting this laptop. Are they thinking about the device, or are they thinking about the capabilities of the device? The more sophisticated a device is, the more opportunities there probably are for potential misuse by themselves or by people they encounter. Do your children know about age restrictions? And do you engage your parents? Well, the answer is children probably know about the age restrictions, and so do the parents. But it's probably equally true that despite those age restrictions, they still use things they shouldn't be. WhatsApp shouldn't be used by under 16s, but we know even in primary school, they use WhatsApp, sometimes for the wrong reasons. They shouldn't be using Instagram, Snapchat. That's got an age limit of 13, but we know that they do. If we simply tell children to stop using it, that's likely to have the opposite effect. But what we need to teach them is the impact it can have on each other, or being unpleasant online, and the impact it can have on themselves. We also need to teach them that there is actually no such thing as delete. They might delete something on the screen, but somewhere it's going to be captured. Somebody might have taken a screenshot. And of course, every stroke of a computer is recorded somewhere, and somebody can always track back to what someone has done, and they can even trace the computer and the time the message was sent. Sometimes those harsh messages need to be taught, because that's thinking, that question there, do we prevent or do we cure? It's very difficult probably to prevent, but we can cure some things. We can actually get children thinking about how they use different devices. Because cyberbullying is something that very much will form part of our children's lives, sadly. And it's important to teach children the meanings of terms like trolling, sea lining, gaslighting, and piling on. That will be familiar to many adults who use social media. And I'm afraid we have seen plenty of opportunities for that in major events in recent times. An example of that would be what happened to England footballers who didn't score their penalties in the Euro 2020 final. There was an instant amount of trolling went on there towards Marcus Rashford and co. It's important to teach children that messaging, video, social exclusion, shaming, and sexting are things that can occur and are things that can actually lead them into some possible dangers, which include safeguarding dangers. And finally, in thinking about others, I'd like to think about building trust within the broad sweep of a wellbeing curriculum. And trust is very much linked to what we said so far about well-being and character, thinking back to those character traits earlier on. A safe and secure environment in a school will enable positive relationships to thrive. Now, that safety and security, we don't always emphasize to the children. Perhaps we need to teach them a bit more obviously that we are making things safe and secure for them. We also need to teach them about identifying when support and trust, when to ask for support when trust breaks down. A very obvious place where trust will break down for children is when they have fallouts in their friendships. Even if we know that very soon afterwards, perhaps the next playtime, they might make up that friendship. But sometimes, particularly as they get older and the hormones kick in, those breakdowns of relationships might become a bit more long-term. And of course, a very obvious way that children will have their trust impacted is when there is marital breakdown, which sadly has been an ongoing problem for many of our children. Knowing who to turn to, knowing who to turn to for support. If you have a good culture of support in your school, those children will come and tell you when there is an issue at home like that. How often do you have a relationship or marital breakdown that you don't find out about until many weeks later? If you have had that experience, it may be that children haven't got that level of trust to share that with the school. Alongside building trust, building resilience. We mentioned that in our character trait before. Building resilience, knowing how to deal with the breakdown of trust, is an absolutely essential way of developing strong character in our children. The final part of the wellbeing curriculum in your school is about putting values into action. Representation and leadership is one way of thinking about that. What's the opportunities for pupil voice? Pupil voice doesn't always have to be the vocal side of that. Many of our children haven't got the confidence to speak openly, as we know, but they might express their opinions and thoughts visually, through drawing and writing. Do you promote the opportunities for that put in place? And by their pupil voice, I mean the impact on the things that go on outside of learning. Do they express how they feel about behaviour, lunchtimes, lunches? School council is a very obvious way of allowing children the opportunity to represent everyone and to lead. But do the school council jobs, particularly the jobs of chair and secretary, which traditionally go to year 6 pupils, do they go to the stereotypically popular children? Or do we give other children the opportunity? Have a think about that. Is it just the sort of people who the leadership of the school think would be good? Or do we allow children who are quieter? Do we allow children perhaps whose behaviour has not always been the most appropriate to take roles in leading the school? Because you never know, that could be the absolute making of them. The school council is traditionally quite a job which draws attention to people. Not all children will like attention, but there's other opportunities to lead. I think about being a digital leader, taking responsibility for not only turning computers on and off at the beginning of the day, but it could be helping children to log on. Anyone who's taught in reception in year 1 will know that they might have spent an entire lesson getting the children to log on and then log off on a computer. But a couple of handy children from year 4 and 5 who can do that for them can save a huge amount of time and also give some responsibility to those pupils. Those pupils are also potentially good contact points if somebody has a problem online, as we mentioned in previous section, because they may be able to communicate that concern in a different manner as a third party to teachers, and they can then act further upon it. Sports ambassadors, again, doesn't have to be the most gifted sports people. Are they people who are representative? Do they know how to lose? Do they know how to win with grace? Playground buddies, peer mediators. Many children enjoy the opportunity to do this. They might go down to the infant playground to lead play, lead some games that they've been taught. As a peer mediator, they might be very good at solving little disputes between children, but perhaps if an adult intervened, it might take an awful lot of time and again, may cause a little problem with trust. Your environmental leaders, they may go down the corridor at lunchtimes making sure that teachers have turned their lights off in their classrooms. They may be responsible for litter picks. They may be responsible for making sure that plants are watered. Again, children have got an interest in that. It's a leadership opportunity. It doesn't have to be something that is shouted from the rooftops, but something they will immensely enjoy and make a difference. Healthy eating ambassadors, I mentioned that earlier. And also classroom monitors. It's not just simply there to make things easier for the teacher. It actually is an important role and it gives a feeling of importance to many children. When it's their turn to sharpen the pencils, when it's their turn to give the books out. We might not think very much about that, but it's incredible the difference it makes to the confidence of some of those children when they have the opportunity to do that. Also, within putting wellbeing values into action, let's think about diversity, particularly equality and equity. Have a think about the language that you use. Teach the word equality, but also teach equity. Equality is giving everyone an equal opportunity to access something. Equity is a little different, and it recognises that sometimes there is a need to be a little more helpful in providing that equal access. Search equality and equity on Google, and you will see a little sketch of 3 children watching a ball game. Tallest one can see, the middle one's got to look through a hole in the fence, and the smallest child can't see anything at all. Equality means giving everyone a box. The tallest one can see better, the middle one can see over the fence, the little one is still looking through a hole in the fence. Equity means giving the taller child no box, the middle one 1 box, and the smaller one 2 boxes, so their heads are all at the same height. A very powerful visual representation of what equity is. We need to think about teaching the language of prejudice and discrimination, what those mean, and identifying what prejudice and discrimination looks like. We need to teach that within race and ethnicity. And this perhaps is an easier one to identify, not only in the use of offensive terms, also from exclusion of certain groups and certain games, which does happen on playgrounds, understanding why it happens and understanding how to intervene to make sure it doesn't happen again. Gender equality and sexism. Have a think about that. Have a think as a teacher, are you equal in the way that you direct your questions in particular lessons? Have a think about, do you promote equal access to football for girls, for example? That's a very obvious point where gender equality is challenged. Do you have a girls' football team in your school? Do you allow opportunity for girls to play football on the playground? And do you intervene when the boys come up with words like, this isn't a game for girls? Also include within this sexuality and disability. Increasingly, sexuality is becoming an issue that needs addressing in primary school, and also particularly addressing the misuse of certain words, which children will hear online, they will hear in their local community, they may hear on television. Discussing why those words are incorrect and how they might be upsetting is an important way of challenging prejudicial and discriminatory behaviour. And then let's think about empowerment. How do you put wellbeing values into action? So what are your school values? Do you know them and can you name them all? And how are they taught? Is it left to the head and the deputy in assembly? Or do you have specific lessons to cover them in class? Is it simply put on display? Or is it talked about? Is it just for lessons? Or are they embraced at playtimes and lunchtimes as well? What role do you have for British values in your school? Obviously, it should be in place, but how do you celebrate it? How do you mark democracy? How do you show that the rule of law and respect for others is included within your school community? And finally, and this really ties up the culture of wellbeing, do the values for the children align with the values for your staff? Again, is the equality of opportunity for wellbeing for your children also there for your teachers, your teaching assistants, and your office staff? I hope you've been provided with some food for thought in the course of these last several minutes. If you wish to find out more about what I've written, you can find me on Twitter at these two handles, Healthy Toolkit being my group where I blog, on particularly on staff wellbeing, and also you can find me in print, the Wellbeing Curriculum and the Wellbeing Toolkit, both published by Bloomsbury Education. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to be able to catch up with you again soon in the future.